Life is a journey, and each of us is a traveler carrying questions, dreams, and, inevitably, scars. We walk uncertain roads, searching for purpose, meaning, and a place where we can finally say, "I belong." Sometimes the path is clear, lit by the certainty of who we are. At other times, we find ourselves in dark stretches where doubts surround us like fog, and it's in that moment that we are invited to a courageous act: vulnerability. But do we have the courage to walk in that direction and show ourselves fully, without the masks and defenses we've learned to build over the years? What if vulnerability was actually the gateway to a more authentic and meaningful life? Personal growth doesn't come from perfection, but from the failures that force us to rise again. And maybe the question we should be asking ourselves isn't how can I avoid vulnerability? But rather, how can I embrace it as the first step on my journey of self-discovery? At first glance, vulnerability might seem like a crack in our armor, an opening through which criticism, rejection, or failure might enter. But contrary to what many believe, vulnerability isn't a sign of weakness, it's an act of courage. It represents the willingness to be seen, to show up in our full humanity, without any guarantees of acceptance or success. Brené Brown, one of the leading voices on this subject, teaches us that vulnerability is not winning or losing, it's having the courage to show up and be seen when you can't control the outcome. This quote perfectly captures the essence of vulnerability: the willingness to show up, even when the ground feels unstable and uncertain. In a world that values the appearance of strength and control, being vulnerable can seem like a revolutionary act. Yet, it's this openness that allows us to truly connect with others and transform ourselves. By acknowledging our own imperfections, we allow personal growth to flourish, because it's in accepting our vulnerability that we find the freedom to be authentic. So maybe the question isn't, how can I avoid vulnerability, but rather, how can I use it as a tool to grow and connect more deeply with the world around me? Accepting vulnerability is, in fact, accepting our humanity. It allows us to let go of the idea of perfection and recognize that personal growth isn't a straight line, but a spiral of ups and downs, where failures and mistakes are inevitable and necessary. By allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we open the doors to deeper transformation, a journey where imperfections become the fertile ground for change. Carl Rogers, a renowned humanist psychologist, once said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." This concept perfectly illustrates how accepting our vulnerability is the starting point for real growth. When we stop fighting against the parts of ourselves that we deem inadequate, we begin to create space for transformation. In that space, resilience begins to emerge, shaped by honesty and self-acceptance. Look, for example, at those who have transformed their lives by accepting their flaws. Think of an artist who had their work rejected countless times but persisted despite the pain of rejection. Or an entrepreneur who watched their business fail, only to rise again stronger. In each of these stories, growth didn't come from the absence of mistakes, but from the ability to face their own vulnerability, learning from failures and adapting as a result. Vulnerability is, therefore, the seed of resilience. Every time we admit a weakness, learn from our mistakes, or ask for help, we grow a little more. It's in the act of stripping away defenses that an inner strength emerges, built on the acceptance of one's truth. By letting go of absolute control and embracing uncertainty, we become more flexible, more prepared for the inevitable changes of life. Thus, true growth is not about never falling, but about getting up with a deeper understanding of oneself. And it all begins with the simple yet powerful acceptance of vulnerability. Authentic relationships aren't born from perfection, but from openness. When two people allow themselves to be vulnerable, revealing their insecurities, fears, and dreams, they build a bridge of trust that makes the relationship deeper and more meaningful. Vulnerability is, then, the invisible link that strengthens human connections, whether in love, friendships, or even professional relationships. Brené Brown teaches us that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. This statement highlights how vulnerability isn't just a path to personal growth, but also the foundation of all relationships that truly matter. When we allow ourselves to be fully seen, with our flaws and uncertainties, we offer those around us the opportunity to do the same. It's in this space of sincerity that the strongest bonds are formed. The same applies in the workplace. Leaders who are vulnerable enough to admit when they don't have all the answers or when they make mistakes are the ones who build more cohesive and innovative teams. By showing that they are human, these leaders create work environments where team members feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, and learn. Vulnerability here isn't a weakness, it's a strength that fosters collaboration and creativity. So, whether in our personal or professional relationships, vulnerability allows us to go beyond the surface, to a place where true connection can flourish. The fear of being judged or rejected often stops us from fully showing ourselves, but in doing so, we also miss the chance to build something genuine. Therefore, by lowering our defenses, we create the possibility of richer, fuller relationships, where love and empathy can truly thrive. The fear of showing vulnerability is one of the biggest obstacles we face on our personal growth journey. We live in a society that often glorifies invulnerability, where showing flaws or weaknesses is seen as a threat to our reputation or self-esteem. However, this fear of exposing ourselves not only keeps us from deeply connecting with others, but also from connecting with ourselves. Overcoming this fear isn't easy. It takes practice, patience, and, above all, small doses of courage in everyday life. The first step might be something simple, like admitting that you don't know the answer to a question in a conversation. Or perhaps asking for help on a project at work, acknowledging that you can't do everything alone. These small acts of vulnerability create a space of trust, not just with others, but with yourself. A practical strategy for overcoming the fear of vulnerability is to start with small steps. Instead of diving headfirst into the deep waters of emotional exposure, try dipping your toes in. Share a recent challenge with a close friend, or reveal an insecurity in a safe environment. The more you practice these small acts of vulnerability, the more natural they become, and the more you realize that vulnerability is actually a strength, a doorway to growth. What holds us back from taking that first step toward vulnerability? Often, it's the fear of judgment or rejection that paralyzes us. But what if we saw vulnerability as an act of freedom, a way to live authentically, without the chains of perfection? By allowing others to see us as we truly are, imperfect, yes, but always evolving, we create a space for them to do the same. So, the question is, what can you do today to be a little more vulnerable? Perhaps by taking that small step, you'll find that vulnerability doesn't weaken you but, in fact, strengthens you. Vulnerability and resilience walk hand in hand, like two sides of the same coin. Every time we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we face the unknown, the chance of failure, of being judged, of getting hurt. But at the same time, this exposure to risk is what makes us stronger. It's precisely in this act of letting go of control that resilience begins to form. Just as steel is forged by fire, our inner strength is shaped by confronting our vulnerabilities. Science also shows us how vulnerability strengthens us. Research on stress and post-traumatic growth reveals that, while suffering is inevitable, those who accept and face their difficulties with an open attitude often emerge stronger and more capable of handling future challenges. That's because resilience doesn't come from denying or resisting vulnerability, but from the ability to accept it and grow from it. Therefore, vulnerability and resilience form a cycle. Each time we accept our vulnerability, we give ourselves the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become stronger. Instead of avoiding pain or failure, we face these experiences head-on, knowing that, in the end, we'll emerge better prepared for life's challenges. The metaphor here is clear. We are like steel that, when passed through fire, isn't destroyed but strengthened. Likewise, each time we confront our vulnerabilities, our resilience is forged. And thus, we become more equipped to face life's uncertainties and challenges. Vulnerability is, in many ways, the first step in a powerful journey. It challenges us to remove the masks we wear and present ourselves as we truly are, imperfect, but whole. Along this path, we discover that true strength doesn't come from the absence of flaws, but from the courage to expose ourselves to risk, to the unknown, to uncertainty. And it is precisely in that moment, when we feel most fragile, that we find our greatest potential for growth. The courage to be vulnerable is the key that opens doors to new possibilities. When we choose vulnerability, we let go of the illusion of total control over our lives and make room for life to surprise us. It's a brave act to admit that we don't have all the answers, that we sometimes make mistakes, and that we need others. By doing so, we connect more deeply with the world around us and, most importantly, with ourselves. Now, I ask you, what if vulnerability was your greatest source of power? What if, starting today, you chose to be more authentic, more open, and more courageous in your vulnerability? Perhaps the life you desire, the relationships you long for, and the growth you seek are waiting on the other side of that courage. Vulnerability isn't the end, but the beginning. It's the first step toward a fuller, more truthful, and more meaningful life. What steps are you willing to take on this journey?